Welcome to the Pardis channel. Today we explain Leviticus chapter 22 in a clear and simple way, step by step. So, to really set the scene and understand exactly where we are in this narrative, I want you to imagine the Israelites camped out in the vast wilderness. The tabernacle, the mobile sanctuary where God's presence actually dwells, has just been constructed. God is speaking directly to Moses at the tent of meeting, handing down some highly specific operational procedures. Leviticus chapter 22 is an incredibly detailed text. It lays out the precise requirements for the priests, the holy food, and the animals brought to the altar. Basically, it's a text entirely focused on the concept of boundaries, who can do what, when they can do it, and the absolute highest standard of physical perfection required in this ancient sanctuary. We're going to walk through every single verse so we can understand exactly what it meant in its original context.
We start right off with verses 1 and 2, where God establishes the core context of the entire chapter. The Lord speaks to Moses, instructing him to tell Aaron and his sons, the priesthood, that they must treat the sacred offerings of the Israelites with absolute respect. Aaron and his sons, they had an immensely heavy responsibility. They were the intermediaries, literally handling the actual provisions dedicated to God on a daily basis. The text explicitly says they have to handle these items carefully so that they won't profane my holy name. Now, in the biblical worldview, profaning something doesn't necessarily mean actively cursing it. It actually means taking something that is deeply, intensely holy and treating it as if it were just common, ordinary, or casual. So God is setting the baseline right here. The offerings brought by the people are sacred, and the priests carry a really solemn duty to handle them with the utmost care. They can never lose their sense of awe.
All right, moving right into section 1, Purity and the Priests, which covers verses 3 through 9.
Here, the text shifts from the general command of respect to some highly specific, strict purity laws. These laws temporarily restricted a priest from approaching or eating the sacred offerings. According to verses 4 through 6, a priest becomes ceremonially unclean through various daily occurrences. The text lists things like an infectious skin disease, a bodily discharge, touching something defiled by a corpse, touching an unclean crawling thing, like certain desert lizards or insects common to their environment, or even touching any person who makes him unclean. Now, this is absolutely vital to understand. Becoming unclean in this ancient context is not a moral sin. It really isn't. It's not something you need to repent for. It is simply a temporary state of ritual impurity that happens through normal biological functions or just unavoidable daily contact in an ancient desert camp. However, because the priest operates in the holy sanctuary, if he has any of these physical conditions, he is strictly forbidden from eating the sacred offerings until he goes through a designated cleansing process.
But the text provides a really straightforward, highly accessible path to ritual purity. Verses 6 and 7 explain that the priest must bathe his whole body in water and then simply wait for the sun to go down. This actually brings up a fascinating fact about the ancient Hebrew concept of time. Unlike our modern clocks where a new day begins at midnight, in the biblical calendar, sunset marks the beginning of a brand new day. So once the sun goes down, his temporary impurity from the previous day officially expires. He crosses the threshold into a new day, is considered clean, and can eat the sacred offerings again, because as the text notes, there has daily food. It's a highly structured yet completely accessible system of boundaries and restoration.
Verse 8 adds a very specific dietary restriction for the priest. He must never eat an animal found dead of natural causes or an animal torn by wild beasts. Eating this would instantly defile him. You might wonder, why is this rule so strict? Well, it's because an animal that dies in the wild hasn't had its blood properly drained, and theologically, it represents death and decay. And that is the exact opposite of the pure, vibrant life required in the sanctuary. Verse 9 then acts as a severe warning. The priests must strictly keep these requirements, or they will bear guilt and die for treating God's sanctuary with contempt. The sanctuary is a zone of pure life. Bringing undrained death into proximity with it is a massive clash of states, and it carries heavy consequences.
Next up, section 2, who can eat holy food, covering verses 10 through 16. Here, the text defines the exact boundaries of who under the priest's roof is actually allowed to consume these sacred portions.
Moving into verses 10 and 11, the text draws these strict legal lines around the priest's household, and it gives us some incredible insight into ancient Near Eastern sociology. An outsider, meaning anyone not officially of the priestly family, cannot eat the holy food. This includes temporary residents, visiting guests, and hired workers. Even if a hired worker is living right there on the priest's property and working the land every single day, legally, they are an outsider simply doing a job. Therefore, they can't eat the sacred portions. But look at the contrast here. A slave bought with money, or a slave born in the priest's household, is allowed to eat the sacred food. In the economic and social structure of the ancient world, a bought or born slave was legally considered permanent property and an enduring part of the household's identity. Because they were permanently attached to the priest, they shared in the household's sacred provisions.
Now, the rules shift for a priest's daughter in verses 12 and 13. We can frame this as a very real human scenario to understand exactly how the law worked. Imagine a priest's daughter who grows up eating the holy food. She then marries a commoner, say an Israelite farmer from another tribe. Legally, she leaves the priestly household and joins his. Because of that, she completely loses access to the holy food. But imagine tragedy strikes. She's widowed or divorced and has no children to care for her. What happens to her then? Well, the law acts as a powerful safety net. She is allowed to return to her father's house as in her youth. Her household status legally reverts back to her father's lineage, and she can eat from his table again. However, if she has a child from her non-priest husband, she remains legally tied to her child's household lineage and cannot eat the priest's food. It's a super intricate system built entirely on strict legal household boundaries and lineage.
In verse 14, we see an early, highly practical principle of restitution. If an unauthorized person, someone outside those legal boundaries we literally just discussed, eats a sacred offering by mistake, they are held strictly accountable. For example, imagine a visiting friend is over at the priest's house, gets a little hungry, and accidentally eats a loaf of the sacred bread right off the kitchen table. They don't just say oops and move on. No, they have to calculate the exact value of the food consumed, add a fifth, so a 20% penalty, and pay it back to the priest. This rule ensures the priests are never robbed of their rightful provisions and reinforces the serious boundary around sacred property, even when the violation is a complete, honest accident.
Okay, on to section 3. Unblemished animal offerings, covering verses 17 through 25.
So the crucial point here is that we're transitioning from the people eating the food to the incredibly strict physical requirements of the animals being sacrificed. Verses 18 through 20 lay out a universal rule for any Israelite or alien living among them who brings a burnt offering. Whether it is to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering, it has to meet a very specific, uncompromising standard. The animal must be from the cattle, sheep, or goats, and it must be a male entirely without defect to be accepted. The Hebrew word used here is Tamim, which means complete, whole, entirely flawless. The text explicitly says, do not bring anything with a defect because it simply will not be accepted by God.
Verses 22 and 24 leave absolutely no room for confusion. They explicitly list unacceptable physical blemishes. You cannot offer an animal that is blind, injured, maimed, or has warts, festering, or running sores. You cannot offer an animal whose testicles are bruised, crushed, torn, or cut. Keep in mind, this was a deeply agrarian society. These people were shepherds and farmers. They knew their flocks intimately. Selecting a flawed, blind, or diseased animal out of the herd wasn't just some casual oversight, it was a highly intentional choice. In the context of the biblical sanctuary, physical wholeness is a direct reflection of internal reverence. Choosing a damaged animal to give to God was a deliberate sign of disrespect, essentially offering the creator of the universe something you wouldn't even want for yourself or your own family.
But there is one fascinating nuance in verse 23 that breaks the absolute rule, and it really shows the beautiful depth of the text. If a person brings an offering completely of their own free will, a spontaneous gift of pure gratitude, an ox or sheep that is merely deformed or stunted is actually allowed. However, if the animal is brought to fulfill a formal vow, it is strictly forbidden. Why the difference? Because a vow is a strict, binding legal contract. You have to fulfill the absolute letter of the law with a perfect specimen. But a free will offering, that is driven entirely by the generous intention of the heart. The rigid physical standard is slightly softened to accommodate the spontaneous, loving desire of a person just wanting to give a gift to God.
To protect the absolute purity of the sanctuary, verse 25 closes this section by prohibiting the Israelites from accepting blemished animals, even from foreigners. Historically, it's pretty fascinating that ancient Israel actually welcomed offerings from foreigners and outsiders, which was somewhat unique in the ancient Near East. But while their participation was entirely welcome, their offerings had to meet the exact same flawless standard. The text notes that the corruption or blemish makes them unacceptable. This really emphasizes that God's standards for holiness don't drop or change just to be accommodating to a visitor. The standard of the altar is absolutely universal.
All right, section 4, rules for sacrificial timing, covering verses 26 through 30.
Verses 26 through 30 shift from the physical condition of the animal to the calendar of the sacrifice, outlining these really early principles of order. Verse 27 visualizes a clear life cycle timeline.
When a newborn calf, lamb, or goat is born, it must stay with its mother for 7 full days. It is only considered acceptable for an offering from the 8th day onward. The text mandates that the animal has to experience its first full week of life, nursing from its mother and fully establishing its existence in the physical world. In biblical literature, the 8th day is highly significant, just like the timing of circumcision for a child, representing a new beginning and readiness to enter a covenantal or sacred state. It literally can't be rushed.
And this next part brilliantly illustrates a profound level of compassion built directly into the text. Verse 28 explicitly commands that a mother animal, whether a cow or a ewe, and its young must never be slaughtered on the exact same day. Even within an ancient system that fundamentally requires animal sacrifice, there's a boundary of profound emotional sensitivity. To wipe out a mother and her offspring on the exact same day is treated as a cruel, unnatural severing of the life cycle. The biblical law strictly prohibits it. This proves that the divine law is concerned not just with ritual mechanics, but with actively preventing callousness and cruelty from taking root in the human heart.
Furthermore, verses 29 and 30 dictate the timing for eating a sacrifice of thanksgiving. The rule is incredibly simple. It must be consumed entirely on the same day it is offered, with absolutely nothing left until the morning. Think about the practical result of this rule for a second. You simply cannot have one family eat an entire cow or sheep in a single day before it spoils. To actually obey this law, the person offering the Thanksgiving sacrifice is practically forced to knock on their neighbors' doors and invite their friends, the extended family, and the poor to join the feast. The timing rule naturally generates a massive community celebration of gratitude, making sure the bounty is shared with everyone.
Which brings us to Section 5, Key Ideas and Lessons, found in the final verses 31 through 33.
As we reach the final verses of the chapter, the text transitions from these highly detailed operational rules to sweeping theological statements. Verse 31 anchors all of these detailed procedures in a simple truth: keep my commands and follow them. I am the Lord. The biblical text here is immensely action-oriented. In modern times, we often prioritize abstract conceptual theology, but in Leviticus, physical obedience is the theology. The meticulous rules about daily purity, respecting household boundaries, and checking for animal perfection are fundamentally about showing reverence through deliberate, intentional actions.
Verse 32 provides the ultimate why behind the entire chapter. Do not profane my holy name. I must be acknowledged as holy by the Israelites. Bringing a blind sheep, ignoring ritual boundaries, or treating the sacred food casually ultimately profanes the holy name. God states clearly, I am the Lord who makes you holy and who brought you out of Egypt. Pause and really think about that. The Exodus is the foundational reason they owe God this meticulous respect. He bought their physical freedom from slavery, and in return, they owe him their unwavering dedication to his standard of holiness.
Practically, Leviticus 22 teaches us several powerful lessons today, even without a physical altar in front of us. First, it challenges us to bring our unblemished best to our endeavors. In modern terms, bringing your unblemished best means not phoning it in at work, in your creative pursuits, or in your relationships. Second, it teaches us to respect the boundaries of others, just as the priests had strict, unbreakable household limits. Third, it reminds us to integrate deep compassion into our actions, as we saw in the care for the mother animal and her young. True structure never eliminates empathy. And finally, that 20% penalty rule teaches us to be immediately accountable. When you make a mistake that costs someone else, don't just apologize. Make generous restitution to make them whole again.
So, to quickly recap this extensive chapter, it systematically guided us through the precise, practical, physical purity required of the priests before they could even approach the altar. We learned exactly who was legally considered part of the household to eat holy food, and how that protected the vulnerable. We explored the flawless, unblemished nature required of the sacrifices, the wonderfully compassionate rules regarding their timing and community feasts, and finally, the ultimate call to acknowledge the sacred through everyday obedience. I'll leave you with this final question to reflect on. How can you bring your unblemished best to your daily commitments while honoring the boundaries around you? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.